The first thing I noticed was the smell of freshly cut grass from my neighbor's perfect lawn. The second was the 3-foot square he'd never touched, a dark, overgrown patch he treated like a shrine or a cage. When I finally asked him why, his answer began a nightmare that I'm still living in. This happened 2 years ago, right after Sarah and I bought our first house. I'm an architect, and my wife Sarah is a graphic designer, so you could say we were a little obsessive about the details. We spent months looking for a place with good bones, something we could really pour ourselves into and make our own. We finally found it in Crestwood Hills, a quiet, almost sterile suburban development built in the late 80s. The neighborhood had that uniform vibe, lots of beige vinyl siding, perfectly trimmed hedges, and those little mailboxes with family names neatly stenciled on them. It was the kind of place where the only sounds you heard in the morning were the hiss of automatic sprinklers and the distant hum of the freeway. It smelled faintly of cut grass and warm mulch. Our house was a modest 2-story colonial at the very end of a cul-de-sac, which gave us a bit more privacy. It felt safe. That was the word we kept using with each other, with our parents, with ourselves. Safe. It was the ultimate comfort after years of renting apartments in the city. Our next door neighbor was a man named Arthur Abernathy. From what we could tell, he was probably in his late 60s, retired, and lived alone. His house was a mirror image of ours, a blueprint flipped horizontally. But his lawn was a work of art. It was a perfect, uniform carpet of emerald green, the kind you see in advertisements for Scott's Turf Builder. It was pristine. Except for one thing. Right in the middle of that immaculate lawn, equidistant from the street and his front porch, was a perfect 3-foot by 3-foot square of overgrown, uncut grass. The first time I saw it, I figured he just missed a spot, or maybe his mower had run out of gas. It was a strange oversight, but forgivable. But the next weekend, I was out front planting some hydrangeas Sarah had bought, and I watched him mow. He guided his gas-powered Toro with the precision of a surgeon, creating these perfect, satisfyingly straight diagonal lines across the yard. When he got to the square, he didn't slow down or hesitate. He just maneuvered the mower around it in a wide, deliberate arc. He didn't even get close. Sarah and I started laughing about it. It became our little inside joke. We called it the patch. We'd come up with theories. Maybe it's a portal to another dimension, she'd say while sketching at the kitchen table. Or maybe that's where he buries the bodies of the mailmen who step on his grass, I'd reply. We figured it was just one of those weird old guy things, a harmless eccentricity that made our new, otherwise cookie-cutter neighborhood feel like it had a little character. Looking back now, the word harmless was the first of many, many mistakes I'd make in judging Mr. Abernathy. It was the foundation of a sense of security that was about to be systematically dismantled, one blade of grass at a time. My fascination with the patch didn't start overnight. It grew slowly, like a fungus in a damp, dark corner. I work from home, and my office is on the second floor, with a large window that looks directly onto Abernathy's front yard. It became a kind of living diorama on my desk. At first, it was just a background detail, but soon it became the main event. I started noticing the sheer amount of time and effort he dedicated to his lawn, and specifically to the patch. It wasn't just the weekly mowing. He was out there every morning, usually just after sunrise, inspecting the turf. He'd walk the perimeter of his property slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, looking for weeds or imperfections, but his focus always, inevitably, came back to the patch. He would never ever cut the grass inside it. But his care for it was far more intense than for the rest of his yard. He'd get down on his hands and knees with a pair of antique-looking, long-bladed grass shears, the kind you might see in an old English film, and he would meticulously trim the grass around the perimeter of the square. It was a painstaking process. He would snip, 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 ensuring the edges were perfectly sharp and defined, that no blade from the manicured lawn dared to cross into the wild territory of the patch. It was a ritual. I tried to rationalize it, to find a logical explanation that would put my mind at ease. My architect brain kicked in first. Maybe it was something practical, like a septic tank lid or a wellhead that he couldn't mow over. But the patch was in the middle of his front yard, an unlikely spot for modern septic systems. Besides, when I zoomed in with my phone's camera one day, I could see there was no lid, no metal, just thick, undisturbed grass. Sarah suggested it was a memorial for a pet. That seemed plausible, sweet even. I could picture him as a younger man burying his childhood dog, maybe a golden retriever named Skipper, in that spot. It made sense. But the intensity of the ritual felt like more than just remembrance. It felt like maintenance. Like he wasn't just preserving a memory, he was actively containing something. There was a gnawing feeling in my gut that this was an act of vigilance, not nostalgia. The grass inside the patch was different too. It seemed to grow faster, thicker, and a shade darker than the rest of the lawn. It was a deep, chlorophyll-heavy green that looked almost black in the twilight. When the wind blew across the cul-de-sac, the rest of Abernathy's lawn would ripple and sway, but the grass in the patch seemed heavier, stiffer. It barely moved. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, a result of it being longer and denser. I told myself not to be paranoid, that I was just a guy with a new house who was probably paying too much attention to his strange, elderly neighbor. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was watching something I wasn't supposed to see, a private, obsessive ceremony whose purpose was just beyond my understanding. After a month of living there, I still hadn't actually spoken to Abernathy beyond a polite, distant wave when one of us was getting the mail. He kept to himself, and honestly, we were fine with that. But one Saturday, a bright, sunny afternoon, I was out front wrestling with a new sprinkler head that I just couldn't get to stop sputtering. I was on my knees in the grass, covered in a fine layer of mud and frustration, when a shadow fell over me. I looked up. It was Abernathy, standing at the edge of his property, separated from me by the low line of boxwood hedges that marked our property line. He was holding his grass shears. They looked bigger, more formidable, up close. "Having some trouble there?" he asked. His voice was surprisingly reedy, thin and dry like old paper. It wasn't the voice I had imagined for. I let out a sigh and explained my sprinkler situation, feeling a little foolish. He offered some generic neighborly advice about water pressure and threaded fittings. It was a perfectly normal conversation, the kind you have 100 times in a new neighborhood. But the whole time we spoke, his eyes kept flicking back towards his lawn, towards the patch. It was like he had a nervous tic, a constant need to check and make sure it was still there, still contained. I decided to test the waters. My curiosity finally got the better of my sense of privacy. "You have the best lawn in the neighborhood, Mr. Abernathy," I said, trying to sound casual. "I'm trying my best to keep up." He gave a thin, closed-mouthed smile. It didn't reach his eyes. "It's a lot of work," he said. "Demands attention." The phrase hung in the air. Demands attention. I took a breath, my heart starting to beat a little faster. I was always curious about that patch in the middle. Is that a special kind of grass you're growing? His smile vanished. It didn't fade. It was just gone. The friendly neighbor facade dissolved in an instant, like a mask being dropped. His eyes went cold and hard, and his knuckles whitened as he gripped the handles of his shears. He stared at me for a long moment, the silence stretching out, becoming heavy and uncomfortable. The cheerful sounds of the neighborhood, a distant lawnmower, kids laughing down the street, all seemed to fade away. It was just me and him, and the unspoken thing between us. "Some things," he said, his voice low and flat, stripped of its reedy quality and replaced with something heavy, something like gravel, are best left to grow. He then turned without another word, without a nod, or any other social pleasantry, and walked back to his house. The conversation was over. A wave of fear, cold and sharp, washed over me. The kind of fear that prickles the back of your neck. It wasn't just a quirky old man. This was something else entirely. The polite boundary between our yards had just become a battle line, and I had just fired the first shot. That conversation was the spark. My casual neighborly curiosity curdled into a low-grade gnawing obsession. That night, I couldn't sleep. His words, "Some things are best left to grow," played on a loop in my mind. The phrase was so simple, yet so menacing. Around 2 a.m, I gave up trying to rest. I found myself sitting in the dark of my office, the glow of my laptop screen painting my face, typing variations of "leaving a square of grass uncut" into the Google search bar. The internet, in its infinite wisdom, offered a buffet of mundane and bizarre explanations. I scrolled through old, forgotten gardening forums from the early 2000s, the kind with dated layouts and pixelated text. People suggested it could be a soil test plot, an inside joke, or a way to cultivate a specific rare type of sod. Benign explanations that felt completely wrong. Then I found the weirder stuff. I clicked on a link that took me to a paranormal website, and from there I fell down a rabbit hole. There were threads discussing spirit anchors, or ley lines, claiming that a patch of undisturbed, virgin earth could act as a gateway, or, more unnervingly, a prison for entities. There were stories about folk magic, obscure pagan rituals for binding things to the land. I told myself it was ridiculous, the kind of nonsense you read late at night to spook yourself. But the seed of the idea was planted. What if he wasn't keeping people out, but keeping something in? I switched tactics, deciding to look for facts instead of folklore. I started researching the history of our properties. I spent hours on the county assessor's public website, a clunky government portal that looked like it hadn't been updated since 1998. I pulled up old deeds and property records for the entire Crestwood Hills development. I learned that the whole subdivision was built in 1987 on land that used to be a single, large farm owned by a family named the Millers. My research eventually led me to the digital archives of the local historical society, where I found a few grainy black and white photos. One of them showed the old Miller farmhouse. Based on the position of the road and a line of ancient oak trees that were still standing, I figured the farmhouse stood roughly where Abernathy's house was now. The picture was from the 1950s. It was just a house, a leaning barn, and a wide open field stretching towards the horizon. There was no sign of anything unusual, no strange patches of grass. The search was a dead end, and it only deepened my frustration. There was no logical, historical, or even superstitious reason I could find for the patch. And that vacuum of logic made Abernathy's chilling words echo even louder in my head. There was no explanation, which meant the only thing left was his explanation. And I had no idea what that was. Sarah started to worry about me. My obsession was no longer a private, late-night affair. It was bleeding into our days. She'd find me standing motionless at the office window for long stretches, just watching Abernathy's house, waiting for him to emerge. She told me I was projecting, that my stress from the new mortgage and the pressures of my job were making me fixate on our strange neighbor. She tried to be patient. "It's just grass, Alex," she'd say, putting a hand on my shoulder. "Let it go." But I couldn't, because the patch was changing. I was sure of it. The grass within the square wasn't just darker now. It seemed to have a different texture. Normal grass is blade-like, thin. This stuff was thicker, more robust, almost like the reeds you see growing by a pond. And it didn't sway in the wind like the rest of the lawn. It just stood there, unnervingly still, a rigid and defiant block against the breeze. I tried to point this out to Sarah, pulling her over to the window one evening. She stood beside me, squinting at the yard next door as the sun began to set. "Honey, it looks the same," she said gently, her voice full of a careful concern that felt a lot like pity. "I think you're starting to see things." Her dismissal, as kind as it was meant to be, felt like a betrayal. It was the first time this thing, this weird fixation on a patch of grass, had driven a real wedge between us. I felt profoundly isolated, like I was the only one who could see the wrongness of it all, the only one who knew that the placid suburban scene outside our window was a lie. A few days later, my fear was given a new, sickening dimension. It was a hot afternoon, and I saw Abernathy out by the patch. He wasn't holding his shears this time. He was carrying a galvanized steel watering can. He moved with a tenderness I hadn't seen before, watering the square carefully, as if it were a bed of prize-winning roses. But the liquid he poured wasn't water. It was thick and dark, almost black, and as he tilted the can, a faint, coppery smell drifted across the property line and into my open office window. It was a scent I recognized from my grandfather's garden, the smell of blood meal, a nitrogen-rich fertilizer made from dried, powdered animal blood. I've used it myself on tomato plants, but the sheer quantity he was using, pouring gallon after gallon of this dark slurry onto that small patch of earth, felt excessive, sickening. He wasn't just fertilizing it. The careful, almost reverent way he moved, the look of intense focus on his face, he was feeding it. My sleep schedule was completely destroyed. I'd lie awake for hours next to Sarah, her breathing even and slow, while my mind raced, replaying my conversation with Abernathy, picturing the dark, thick liquid he poured onto the soil. The image of him feeding the patch became an intrusive thought, popping into my head while I was drafting blueprints or trying to have dinner. The casual unease I'd felt had metastasized into a constant low-level dread. Sleep, when it came at all, was shallow and unsatisfying. I started getting up in the middle of the night. I'd slip out of bed, careful not to wake Sarah, and creep into my office. I wouldn't turn on a light. I'd just go to the window and look out at the silent, sleeping cul-de-sac. I was just checking, just making sure everything was normal. I told myself it was for peace of mind, but really it was the opposite. I was looking for proof that things were not normal, and my vigil was soon rewarded. One night, around 3 a.m., I saw him. The moon was nearly full, casting a pale, skeletal light over the manicured lawns and identical houses of Crestwood Hills. The world outside was washed in shades of silver and black, and there, in the center of his yard, was Mr. Abernathy. He was standing directly over the patch, his back to me. He was wearing what looked like thin cotton pajamas, and he was barefoot on the damp grass. He wasn't moving. He wasn't watering or trimming or digging. He was just standing there, perfectly still, his head bowed slightly as if in prayer or deep contemplation. The sight sent a cold sweat breaking out across my skin. My heart started a frantic, muffled drumming against my ribs. I watched him for what felt like an eternity, but the clock on my desk told me it was maybe 10 or 15 minutes. He didn't move a muscle. He was like a statue, a silent guardian posted over his strange, dark plot of land. There was an awful stillness to him, a focused intensity that was terrifying. I felt like I was intruding on something deeply private, something ancient and profoundly wrong. I finally backed away from the window, my legs unsteady. I crept back to bed, my heart still pounding in my chest. This wasn't a hobby. This wasn't a memorial. This was a vigil, and I had the sickening feeling that he wasn't just watching over it. He was waiting for something. I knew it was a stupid idea. Looking back now, it was unbelievably stupid. Every rational part of my brain, the part that designs buildings with fire codes and structural supports, was screaming at me not to do it. But my fear had been simmering for so long that it had boiled over into a desperate, reckless need for answers. I couldn't live with the not knowing anymore. I had to know what was in that patch of grass. I waited for a Tuesday morning. From my window, I learned Abernathy's routine. Tuesday at 10 a.m. was his regular grocery day. I watched from my office as his old beige Buick sedan pulled out of the driveway and headed down the street. I waited another 5 minutes just to be sure. My hands were shaking. I went downstairs and told Sarah I was going out to check the mail, a flimsy excuse that she accepted without looking up from her laptop. I slipped out the front door, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I felt it in my throat. The street was empty, the air was still. I scurried across my own lawn, my feet feeling heavy, and vaulted the low boxwood hedge that separated our worlds. Setting foot on Abernathy's perfect grass felt like sacrilege, like walking across an altar. I walked directly to the patch, my eyes darting back and forth, scanning for any sign of a returning car. Up close, it was even more unsettling. The grass was cool to the touch, despite the warm morning sun, and the blades felt unnaturally slick and waxy. I knelt down, my jeans soaking up the morning dew, and parted the thick, reedy blades. The soil underneath was a dark, wet black, almost like potting soil, and it smelled earthy and sharply metallic, like old pennies. I poked a finger into the dirt. It was soft, loose, recently disturbed. And then I felt something, just an inch or two beneath the surface. My fingertip brushed against something hard and smooth. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a rock. It was too uniform, too deliberate in its shape. I started to dig with my fingers, frantically, clumps of the dark, cold soil getting trapped under my nails. The object was just becoming visible, a pale, curved surface, when the sound of a car engine turning onto our cul-de-sac sent the jolt of pure white-hot adrenaline through me. Abernathy was back. He must have forgotten his wallet or his grocery list. I didn't think. I just reacted. I scrambled back, wiping the dirt from my hands onto my jeans, and sprinted back towards my own yard. I dove behind a large oak tree in our front yard, just as his Buick pulled into his driveway. I peeked around the trunk, my heart feeling like it was going to explode out of my chest. Abernathy got out of his car, glanced around the quiet street, and then his eyes settled on the patch. For a second, I was sure he could see the small indentation my fingers had made, but he just gave a slow, deliberate look around before going inside. I slumped against the tree, gasping for breath. The risk had been insane, but I had my answer. Something was buried there. The next morning, I woke up feeling hungover with a fear so potent it felt physical. My head ached, and a sour metallic taste coated my tongue. I kept replaying my idiotic trespass, the feel of the cold soil on my fingertips, the slick surface of whatever was buried there, and the sheer dumb luck of my escape. I went through the motions of starting my day, making coffee, answering a few emails, but I couldn't focus. I just sat at my desk in my office, staring at Abernathy's house, waiting for some sign that he knew. I kept expecting to see him march across the lawn, to hammer on our front door, but there was nothing. just the quiet, unnerving stillness of a suburban morning. The sign came around noon. I went downstairs to make a sandwich, my stomach twisting with anxiety. As I stood at the kitchen counter, my back to the window that looked out on our front yard, I felt a strange prickling sensation on my neck. I turned around and looked outside, and I saw it. There, stuck perfectly upright in the middle of my own lawn, about 5 feet from the property line, was one of his tools. It was one of the long-bladed grass shears, its polished silver blades gleaming in the midday sun. It was planted deep in the grass like a dagger, a strange metallic monument on my side of the yard. My sandwich slid from my hand and hit the floor with a soft thud. I couldn't breathe. There was no note. There didn't need to be. The message was as clear as if he had screamed it in my face. I know you were here. I know what you did. Stay away. My blood ran cold. This was a direct violation, a deliberate crossing of the one unspoken, invisible line that keeps suburban life from descending into chaos. He had come onto my property. He had walked across my grass, my territory, and left his mark. The illusion of safety I had clung to, the idea that the boxwood hedge was some kind of meaningful border, shattered into a million pieces. The game had changed. This wasn't just about his lawn anymore. It was about mine. And he had just made the first move. After the incident with the shears, the thin pretense of suburban normalcy evaporated. Abernathy's behavior shifted from passive-aggressive weirdness to open, silent intimidation. The subtle, unsettling dance was over. This was a siege. He stopped pretending not to notice me sitting in my office window. Now, he would look right at me. He'd be out on his front porch in his rocking chair, slowly sharpening the blades of his shears with a whetstone, the rhythmic shing, shing, shing sound carrying across the yards. And his eyes, cold and dark, would be locked on my window. He would stand in his driveway, watering his rose bushes with a hose, and just stare at our house for minutes at a time, his face a blank, emotionless mask. The psychological pressure was immense, a constant low hum of dread that permeated every corner of our lives. Sarah, who had once been my rational anchor, was now terrified. The sight of those shears plunged into our lawn had shattered her skepticism. She finally saw what I saw. This wasn't just a strange old man. This was a threat. Our home no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a fishbowl, and we were the helpless fish being watched by a predator. We started keeping the blinds closed, living in a state of self-imposed twilight even on the brightest days. The simple act of walking to the mailbox became a source of anxiety. We added a new, heavy-duty deadbolt to the front door and bought a security camera system, the kind you get at Costco, in a big box. I felt like a paranoid lunatic setting it up, aiming one camera directly at Abernathy's front yard, another at our own front door. But the fear was overwhelming. He was turning our dream home, the place that was supposed to be our safe harbor, into a prison. And the most terrifying part was that he was doing it without ever saying another word to me. He was winning. He was isolating us, making us prisoners of our own fear, and all with just a look, a gesture, a silent, menacing presence. The security camera footage only made things worse. I thought having objective proof would be a relief, but it just gave my formless anxieties a sharp, terrifying edge. The grainy infrared footage captured Abernathy's strange vigils in stark black and white, confirming I hadn't been imagining them. He was out there at least 3 nights a week, a ghostly figure standing over the patch in the dead of night, motionless. Reviewing the footage became a new, sick ritual for me. Desperate for something concrete, I drove to the county records office. I was determined to find something, anything, that I had missed online. The office was a quiet, dusty place that smelled of old paper and stale coffee. I spent an entire afternoon hunched over a microfiche reader, the machine humming and clicking as I scrolled through brittle, yellowed newspapers from the 1950s, searching for any mention of the Miller farm. My eyes ached from staring at the glowing screen, and then I found it. It wasn't a big headline. It was a small two-paragraph article from August of 1958, buried in the back pages of the local paper. Local boy missing. My heart leaped into my throat. The article stated that an 8-year-old boy named Daniel Miller had vanished from his family's farm 2 days prior. He was last seen playing in the front yard in the late afternoon. An extensive search of the property and the surrounding woods had turned up nothing. No witnesses, no ransom note, no body. He had simply disappeared. My jaw nearly hit the floor. The microfiche machine hummed, oblivious. I read the article 3 times, my hands trembling so badly that the text swam in and out of focus. The boy had vanished from the front yard of the Miller farm, the same yard where Abernathy's house now stood, the same yard where he stood vigil, the same yard where something was buried under a 3x3 patch of unnaturally green grass. All the disparate, terrifying pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. I didn't know how Abernathy was connected, or if he even was a boy back then. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my very soul, that little Daniel Miller never left that farm. He was buried in the patch. A week later, a massive thunderstorm rolled into Crestwood Hills. The sky turned a bruised, ugly purple-black, and rain started coming down in solid, driving sheets. The wind howled, a low, mournful sound that rattled our windows in their frames. It was the kind of storm that felt biblical, apocalyptic, like the world was being washed clean. Sarah and I were in the living room, watching the lightning fork across the sky, the flashes illuminating the neighborhood in stark, terrifying detail. During one of those brilliant, strobing flashes, I saw him. A jagged line of lightning lit up Abernathy's yard for a split second, and I saw his silhouette. He was out in the middle of the deluge, wearing a yellow rain slicker with the hood pulled up. He was standing directly over the patch, and he was holding a shovel. My breath hitched in my throat. Another flash of lightning, closer this time, followed by an immediate deafening crack of thunder that shook the whole house. In that flash, I saw him plunge the shovel into the wet earth. He was digging. In the middle of this violent storm, under the cover of thunder and darkness, he was finally unearthing his secret. "Sarah, call 911, I whispered, my voice hoarse, barely audible over the roar of the rain. "What? Why?" she asked, her eyes wide with alarm. "He's digging, Sarah. He's digging it up right now." I grabbed my phone from the coffee table, my fingers fumbling as I tried to open the security camera app. The Wi-Fi connection was spotty because of the storm, but after a few seconds of buffering, I got a flickering pixelated image. It was him all right, a dark hunched figure in the lashing rain, methodically turning over the soil in that cursed square of land. The image froze, then updated. Another shovelful of dark earth tossed aside. Sarah was on the phone with the dispatcher, her voice a mixture of panic and disbelief. "My neighbor, he's digging in his yard." "Yes, right now, in the storm. I think he buried something there, a long time ago." I could hear the dispatcher's tinny, skeptical voice on the other end, but Sarah was insistent, her voice growing stronger. She was a believer now. There was no more doubt. Only a shared, suffocating fear. We watched the flashing screen of my phone, waiting for the police, praying they would get there in time to see what I knew was about to be revealed. It felt like an eternity before the police cruiser arrived, its red and blue lights washing silently and rhythmically through our rain-streaked windows, painting the walls in flashes of panic. 2 officers, a man and a woman, got out, their faces grim under the wide brims of their hats. They walked over to Abernathy's front door, their boots splashing in the puddles. We watched from our window as Abernathy answered, looking calm, almost confused. A frail old man in a bathrobe, woken from his sleep. He spoke with them for a few minutes, gesturing towards his yard with a hand that seemed to tremble slightly. Then, all three of them, Abernathy included, walked out into the rain with heavy-duty flashlights. They went straight to the patch. My heart was pounding against my ribs. This was it. This was the moment of truth. The officers aimed their bright white beams down at the ground. From my vantage point, all I could see was a square of freshly turned muddy earth. The officers poked around in the mud for a minute with the toes of their boots, their movements casual, almost bored. Then they turned and walked back to Abernathy, who stood there with a patient, almost pitiful look on his face, like a man being unfairly burdened by his hysterical neighbors. One of the officers, the man, came to our door. Rain dripped from the brim of his hat onto our welcome mat. "Folks," he said, his voice tired, "your neighbor says he was just turning over the soil to prepare a new flower bed. He said he wanted to do it during the storm so the rain would soften the ground for him. Makes it easier on his back." I started to stammer, my words tripping over themselves. But the history, the missing boy, Daniel Miller, he vanished from that exact spot. The cop sighed, a deep, weary sound that told me he'd already made up his mind. "Sir, with all due respect, we can't go digging up a man's yard based on a local legend from 60 years ago. There's nothing here. Now, Mr. Abernathy is an elderly man, and he's pretty shaken up by all this. We'd appreciate it if you stop harassing him." He gave me a look that was one part warning and two parts pity. The look you give a crazy person. They left. Abernathy went back inside his house. Sarah and I were left standing there in our own hallway, completely and utterly alone, the sound of the rain against the roof mocking us. We had done the right thing. We had called for help, and the system had not only failed, it had turned against us. We weren't the victims here. We were the harassers. We were the problem. In the days following the storm, Abernathy worked on the patch. He didn't plant flowers. The day after the police visit, a delivery truck from a local nursery arrived and dropped off a pallet of fresh sod. He spent the entire afternoon carefully laying down the new squares of grass, patting each one into place like a blanket. When he was done, the square of turned earth was gone, replaced by a perfect, seamless green. Within a week, the new grass had taken root. It grew back thicker, greener, and darker than ever before. Life in Crestwood Hills returned to a terrifying, superficial normal. The police didn't follow up. Our neighbors continued to wave as they got their mail, completely oblivious to the silent war being waged next door. But for us, for Sarah and me, the world was permanently tilted on its axis. The concept of safety, the very reason we'd bought this house, had become a cruel joke. We put the house on the market. Our realtor was thrilled, telling us how quickly homes were selling in the area. But every time a prospective buyer would come for a showing, I'd watch them from the window, and I'd feel a wave of guilt and sickness wash over me. The thought of another family moving in, of another person falling under Abernathy's silent, watchful gaze makes me sick. We haven't sold it yet. Something always seems to go wrong with the offers. I still see him. He's out there every few days with his shears, meticulously trimming the edges of his perfect 3-foot square. The ritual continues, unbroken. I never found out what happened to Daniel Miller, or what connection Abernathy has to him. I'll most likely never get any answers regarding this experience. The questions just hang there, unanswered and unanswerable. Sometimes when Abernathy is out there, he'll look up at my office window. He knows I'm still watching. And yesterday, that's all for tonight's story. Thank you for watching Horror Story. If these kinds of experiences resonate with you, and if you believe that the most terrifying things are the ones that could happen next door, Don't forget to subscribe to Horror Story and hit the notification bell. It helps the channel more than you know and ensures you won't miss the next account. Until then, stay safe and be careful who you trust. You never know what your neighbors are hiding.